Hello and welcome to English 201 Introduction to Literature at Northwest Christian University. Today we're going to talk a little bit about poetry. To start with, what is poetry? As your Norton made clear, it's a difficult thing to define, isn't it? Because you have to discern where does it depart from other literature, and what makes it different than a short story, for example. And even, you might imagine a reviewer talking about a novel or a story saying, passages of it are poetic, and for example, so that line is blurred. And there's not two boxes where, okay, here's all the poetry, here's all the prose, and all these have these qualities and none of those qualities, and all these vice versa. There's some overlap, and the edges of this set are fuzzy. That's okay. It doesn't mean that we can't talk about poetry and we don't know it when we see it, as the saying goes. So your textbook has a good couple definitions in there. They emphasize the intentional intensity of emotion, the patterns, the rhythm, things like that. And I think those are good starting places. That what literature does, and we talked about using all the spectrum of available potency of words, poetry in particular does as well. So if a story might utilize the two different meanings or multitude meanings of a particular word for a certain effect, well, certainly poetry will do that. If prose uses the sounds of the words themselves to evoke certain emotions, poetry will definitely do that. One thing I would add to these definitions is that we might consider poetry a distillation. Okay, I'm going to use some country music lyrics quickly for an example later, and it happens to be about a six-pack of long necks, and so I'll keep that metaphor going. Poetry might be considered like an aged Scotch whiskey, where in a small sip there's a variety of flavors that bring to mind earth and the fire that might have been used for a certain smoking or drying process of the grain or whatever. I'm not an expert, but there's all these flavors in a very, very small quantity. Well, similarly, poetry, consider it a distillation. You can dip in to a little volume. For example, here's one of my favorites, T.S. Eliot. Let's see if we can get that focused. No, it's not going to focus that. There it is. T.S. Eliot, some of his selected poems. Just a little old book. I can spend a minute in there and be refreshed. If literature in general can be like a best friend and you can return to a book over and over again, well, poetry is almost like that quiet, trusted aunt or confidant that you can sit on the porch with and just kind of remember who you are. So if anything, of course, I just want you to, on your own, fall in love with poetry, which is why I've given you freedom to choose the poems that you read to some degree. So, so what's the point of this comparison with the rest of literature? Well, when you're reading poetry, you'll want to pay attention in a different way. You'll want to pay closer attention almost, because there's more power per square foot, you could say, in poetry than in a novel, generally. I'm going to read you a couple passages from the same poet at different times in his life and very different outlooks. They're both T.S. Eliot. This first one is The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and it goes on for some number of pages, but I'm just going to read you the first paragraph or two or so. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains, let fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and, seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep. And it keeps going. And the reason I read that, and I'll contrast it with another one, is that we might be familiar with poetry as rhyming only, for example, and that every other line rhymes, or this line rhymes with the third line, and etc. And there's some pattern like that. It's very sing-song, and even that particular form of poetry is used for songs, ballads, and things. But I wanted to read this because it's beginning to push the limits in the early 1900s. Beginning to push the limits of that and rearranging rhyme in a certain way, and not even being a slave to a particular pattern, but treating it almost as music or jazz, as this was written at the beginning of the Jazz Age, so that you hear, for example, let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats, and there's these rhymes that aren't just stacked at the end of lines in a predictable way, and then words like streets are repeated at different times where they're not expected, and it creates a certain effect of sort of off-kilter and rhythmic and driving, but without the predictability. It creates a sort of symphony of word sounds. And also the images, very much leading you into a sort of, no, it's a soft October night, as he says, but it's a sort of, the poem is about disillusionment in many ways, that one grows older and things aren't what one thought, and in this particular case, the impossibility of taking action in the midst of that one's kind of paralyzed with that disillusionment. Briefly. Okay, well, here's the ending of a whole book that T.S. Eliot, a collection, I don't know how to say this, it's one poem, one long poem, made up of 4 long poems, this whole book is one poem, as opposed to this, which is just a collection. And this was the last thing he really wrote as a poet. And biographically, it's interesting that he had undergone a conversion to Christianity. He was an Anglican. And this is kind of, after having written some very, very famous and wonderful poetry of disillusionment and despair, really, in the beginning of the 20th century, towards the end of his life, he writes his farewell to poetry with a different tone, and you can almost hear it in the sort of clean musical lines that he creates. This is the end of 4 quartets. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started, and to know the place for the first time. Through the unknown, remembered gate, when the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning. At the source of the longest river, the voice of the hidden waterfall, and the children in the apple tree, not known, because not looked for, but heard, half heard, in the stillness between 2 waves of the sea. Quick now, here, now, always. A condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongues of flame are infolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. And some of those images have been brought up numerous times throughout the book, and so it's this powerful weaving together of them in the end. The point is simply that these are examples of how you ought to pay very close attention to the things we already talked about for literature in general, but specifically with poetry, to the sounds and the repetition and the effect that's being created by the language. As you're looking for the meaning, it's not the kind of thing where you can just brush over a poem and say, that's what it means, or it's not a very good poem if that's the case, but rather that you drink it in, and in doing so, you begin to experience the meaning in a way. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about, one major part of poetry that you can specifically kind of look out for. If literature in general ought to be, any piece, a novel or a story, ought to be a cohesive whole, okay? You ought to be able to make sense of it, and when you read it, when you get to the end, suddenly you kind of say, that's what that was. Even if the ending isn't definitive, or if you feel left hanging, that gives you a whole color with which to kind of paint the story in general. Well, if that's true for any literature, certainly for poetry, you ought to sense when you get to the end of a poem the wholeness of it, that it creates one experience. Okay, one part of that is something called, at least by people who study poetry, it's called the volta, which is Latin for the turn. Okay, I'm going to try to explain what this is briefly, but it's the kind of, I like to think of it like the key that clicks the poem, or that turns on the little machine that kind of goes through its process to unfold its meaning to the reader. It's that key. And it doesn't mean like it's a secret sort of meaning or code hidden. It's an effect of the poetry itself. Sorry, cleaning off my desk here. So, a famous poem is Emily Dickinson's "Because I Could Not Stop for Death." And it's on page 583 if you're going to read it. Well, the whole thing is talking about how Death picks her up in his carriage, and she begins to realize things more and more. But the last couple stanzas provide a volta, or a turn, or a sort of awakening to the meaning of the poem. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Now, as she's going along with this gentleman Death driving his carriage, she sees different things, kids playing in the schoolyard, etc. And at the end, we paused before a house, and it's a swelling of the ground. And of course, you immediately realize that this is a grave. And then you realize that we've been in this immediate sort of story of being driven along by death. And you realize it's been centuries since that day. And that these centuries feel shorter than that day when she, the narrator, it's written by a woman, when she first realized that these horses' heads were toward eternity. And so that whole ending, and the volta is usually at the ending, colors the rest of the poem and gives, a sort of profundity to and nuance to what she's saying about the nature of death. And I won't try to unpack it here, but you can kind of see how as the carriage goes, and then you realize that, okay, she's been dead for centuries. And that whole last stanza unpacks the rest of the poem for you. Well, that's kind of a volta, and that's a subtle one. That's okay, but less subtle. And I brought my special poetry hat. Okay. Oh, spiders made his home there. Sorry about that. Now, why do I have my special poetry hat on? Two reasons. One, one of my very favorite poets is Walt Whitman, and he used to always wear a little smaller than this, but a hat kind of askance on his head. And he would say, well, in one of his lines of poetry, he said, "I wear my hat indoors or out of doors." You know, basically, I do whatever the heck I want. And he's a poet of America in a lot of ways. In the mid 1800s, he gave voice to this emerging Americanness, beginning to understand what freedom meant that had been already inculcated into our founding documents and these sorts of things. That's one reason. The other reason is that some great examples of what poetry does, or especially of the Volta, and we'll kind of end with this fun thing. Some great examples come from country music, and not even the best country music, we'll just say that. But we lived in Texas for 7 years, and I figured, hey, I need to get into country music. And I did find some really good stuff. But then there was also the popular stuff on the radio, some of which is just... But that's okay. Great examples of the Volta. So I just picked up one that I heard the other day and that reminded me, oh yeah, that's like, that's the turn. And the reason I use country music is because if you've listened to it much, especially popular country music, it is just rife with these very in-your-face voltas. What do I mean by that? You'll go through a verse, sometimes 2 whole verses before the first chorus, and you can tell that there's this pun, right? Or this trick of language that's being built up, and then the chorus, boom, explains it all. So let's take a look. This is... You can listen to the recording sometime. I won't sing it for you. This is Cold One by Eric Church. So it starts out, "It was a perfect day for the end of May, they say a record high. I stared at that green water when out of the blue and by surprise, she had her feet up on the cooler as she put our love on ice." That's not the term, but pay attention to the ways that, just like poetry, country music, it uses a lot of double meanings of words. She put our love on ice, which of course just means, put it on a pause to it or whatever. She has her feet up on the cooler. She put our love on ice. She grabbed a beer, said, "I'm out of here," and walked out of my life. That was a cold one. This is the chorus. That was a cold one. And of course that means that was kind of cruel. That was mean. But that's just one line. The next line explains what he actually means and what makes this song funny and good and a country song. That was a cold one. I never will get back. Yeah, she had to leave. Did she have to leave me 1 beer short of a 12-pack? She left me hanging high and dry in that hell-high summer sun. Damn, babe, that was a cold one. So that was a cold one means that was a cruel little thing you just did, right? But it also, it's like, oh yeah, there he was sitting with a cold one. A cold one is, of course, a cold beer. And so he takes this whole song to go back and forth with this. It ain't the first time or the last time I watched love walk out, but it's damn sure the one time, apologize for the cursing, I didn't write it, I still ain't forgot about. I still like to drink a beer, but a long neck I won't do, 'cause every time I see one sweating, which of course sweating means producing condensation, man, I break out in one too. So he breaks out in a cold sweat when he sees the cold sweat on a bottle of beer. The point is that in country music, it's not obviously generally as subtle as in a poem, but it's often, there's a volta that is placed in the chorus, and that every verse relates to that chorus in a different way, and it's this key in this thread that keeps the whole song going and with logic. A little bit of a silly example, but what I'm getting at is that, well, simply that I hope that you'll find your own way to fall in love with poetry. It doesn't have to be now, maybe in some quiet season in your life. Do a little exploring. For me, poetry, even though I'd studied literature, came later in life, but it's one of those gifts like friendship that you really shouldn't do without in life. So Anyway, thanks for listening. There's a little bit on poetry, and take care.